Now, Dr. Kirkwood.
This is a continuation of our study on answering atheism. We looked in lesson 2, we looked at the materialist philosophy and how bankrupt that philosophy was as one of the proofs against atheism. And if you follow materialism to its logical conclusion, then you come up with some rather absurd ideas, such as there's no such thing as free will, there's no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as right or wrong, and just the philosophy itself almost disproves atheism just by looking at from a philosophical point of view. And then 3 weeks ago when we did lesson 3, we looked at various, I would call them logical arguments against atheism. There's the cosmological argument, which is probably one of the best arguments, and that is something that has a beginning, has a cause. We showed ample evidence that the universe had a beginning, therefore it had to have had a cause. Now you can argue about what that cause was, but the most likely thing would be if it had a cause, that cause had to be something of a superior intellect, something certainly that mankind has never seen, and that something would be God. And we looked at the moral argument, we looked at the teleologic argument, which is the argument of looking at purpose, and that things in the universe, things in life, seem to show that there's a purpose to all of it, and the purpose itself implies a God. And we're going to look at that argument a little bit more when we get into lessons 6 and 7 especially. So tonight we're going to look at origin of life and what the materialists say the origin of life, how the origin of life came about. Because if you have this materialist concept, then life had to come about by purely materialistic means. Now, granted, for that to happen, you have to have started with something. And we've already argued that the universe, the particles in the universe, the laws of the universe show that there's a God. But let's say somehow you got to that point and you've got now the basic elements of life, the basic elements of the universe. Now you have to get another step if you're the materialist, and it has to produce life. And so that's what we're going to look at really this study and maybe some next week. And then we're also going to look later on about the concept of mind versus brain, and see if there's such a thing as that division between mind and brain, and mind and spirit, that sort of thing. So the question is, what is life? Seems like a fairly simple question, doesn't it? It's actually a fairly complex question. What actually constitutes life? What is something that, and I'm not talking about human life necessarily, but just life in general. What is the difference between an inanimate, what we would call an inanimate object, or something that actually has life to it? And how would you define that, whether you're a Christian or a materialist? Turns out the materialist has a really tough problem with that, and we're going to discuss that in just a few moments. But as a Christian, as a person, how would you define life? Well, we know that life is composed of DNA. So life is something that has DNA. That's not a really very good explanation for life, though, is it? Now, there's something very unique about life itself. The Bible does talk about this. And look at Genesis 2, verse 7. And we see there, this is concerning mankind. And it says, "And the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed in his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living being." Now, I'm not exactly sure how that went down. But I've got an idea that he formed man out of the dust of the earth. So that basically means he used the elements that are in the universe to form man. And we all know that. You know, we're all made of calcium and water and phosphorus and all the other elements you can think of. And God used that to form man, but he wasn't alive yet. He wasn't a living, breathing soul yet when that happened until he breathed into him the breath of life. You might call it the spark of life. There's certainly something clearly different about something that is dead versus something that is alive. And it's really hard to explain that from a scientific point of view. But we know one thing: we cannot breathe into somebody the breath of life. Someone that is dead is dead. Nobody has ever been resurrected from the dead save for Jesus Christ and those that he raised from the dead, and the apostles and their miracles and so forth. But that was a clearly miraculous act. We cannot do that now. Science cannot do that. Well, you say, well, they resuscitate people, but those people aren't dead. They're not brain dead yet. They have not completely died yet. And so when does that change? It's hard to explain. But we know that God breathed into man the breath of life. And we also know Henry Morrison in his Genesis record says that this idea energized man to become a living soul. Now, animals had already been produced, or had already been made by God, but this Hebrew word of nephesh means an animated, breathing, conscious, living being. That's what that word in Genesis comes from. That's the Hebrew word. But that Hebrew word is also the Hebrew word for all kind of life. So I know, at least from my point of view, that this is not talking about the soul. Okay, when does man get that soul? When was the soul put in him? I'd assume at about the same time. But what this word is talking about is life. Life started, or life for man started, when God breathed it into him. Now, Genesis doesn't say that he breathed into the other animals the breath of life, but yet we know they had that. How do we know that? Because Genesis 22 says that they had the breath of the Spirit of life. This is down talking about during Noah's time, but still the animals have this same breath. So there's something about life that's clearly different than something that is inanimate. But there does seem to be something that separates those two. Life, there's something to be the spirit, and then there's the soul, and there's that dichotomy, and Hebrews 4:12 talks about this. So life is not our soul, it's not our inner being, it is the inanimate part that, or the animate part that makes us alive, living, breathing creatures. The bigger question becomes, why is there life? Now again, the materialist has a problem with that too. We're going to discuss that in a minute. But why did God create life? You ever think about that? Why did he create the universe? Any ideas? Why are we here? That's exactly right. I think I heard that. It's to glorify God, and it's for his glory. Isaiah 43:7 says, "Everyone who is called by my name, whom I have created for my glory. I have formed him, yes, I have made him." We are made for the glory of God. Now, unfortunately, I think that's gone by the wayside with a lot of people, but Christians especially are made for the glory of God. His people, the Hebrews, were for the glory of God, but his whole creation was really for his own glory as well, and was to glorify that. And I think that's sort of implied when you look at Genesis, the Genesis account of creation, where God created everything, and it seems like every time he finished a creation, he said, "Indeed, it was very good." He looked upon his creation, he looked upon the stars and so forth, the earth, and it was very good. So from a Christian standpoint, the purpose of life is to glorify God. And in fact, his entire creation is to glorify God. But let's look at it from a materialist standpoint. What does the materialist say as far as why and what is life? They've got an explanation. It's not very good. And here's a problem with life that the materialist has to deal with. And that is, life seems to go against or defy the second law of thermodynamics. Do you remember what that law said? Everything's running down. Things are getting, things are going downhill, so to speak. Things are deteriorating. That's what the second law of thermodynamics. It's the law of entropy. And so chaos is getting worse, and eventually, according to the law of entropy, the world will burn up, or not burn up, but the universe will reach thermal temperature of zero, and it cease to exist. And there's nothing that we know of that seems to contradict that law, except for life. Life seems to contradict it, because is life complex or is it not complex? It's very complex. The law of entropy says that things should be becoming less complex, not more complex, but life doesn't do that. At least not in the beginning it doesn't. Now we all die and all life dies and we deteriorate at the end, but at the beginning it becomes significantly more complex. And life is, I think everyone would agree, even the materialist would have to agree that life is a very complex thing. And so it does seem to defy the law of entropy, the law of increasing chaos, increasing deterioration, increasing loss. So the materialists, when they're trying to explain, I found this definition very interesting. This is Erwin Schrödinger. Does anyone happen to know who Erwin Schrödinger is? I bet David does. He's and Nate does. He was kind of one of the fathers of quantum physics, and he's responsible for the wave equations. And I don't know all that stuff. I don't pretend to, but I at least know what he did. Very famous when it comes to quantum physics and so forth. So he was asked one time what was life, and they have a hard time answering that question. His answer: life is something that goes on doing something longer than you would expect it to. Yeah, that was the answer. That's your materialist definition of life. But it's sort of true. It does go on longer than you might expect because we're used to things deteriorating, and life doesn't do that. A child is born, it grows, it gets bigger, that sort of thing. All animals do. So Sean Carroll, who I believe is at Caltech, he's a physicist. He's a theoretical physicist, and I've read some of his works and seen some of his videos, especially as it pertains to time. He looked at this idea and said, well, how can life seem to violate the second law of thermodynamics if it's purely materialistic, if there wasn't a God involved? And he says life's complexity is an intermediary state between low and high entropy. Once again, things are trying to go to high entropy, higher disorder. Low entropy, we're going from low to high always since forever. And that's what he says. Life's complexity is an intermediary state. That's all it is. Yeah, and you say, well, that's sort of true because we start off complex and then we die, but and then we deteriorate. But we had to start off becoming more complex through this whole process. So he likens it to a cup of coffee. Our life, you didn't know this, but life is like a cup of coffee. I'm thinking of when I saw this, life is like a box of chocolates. Well, it's not life is like a box of chocolates. Life is actually like a cup of coffee, according to Dr. Carroll. What does he mean by that? Well, when you pour cream into a cup of coffee, first the coffee is black, right? You pour cream into it, and then in between where it's turning brown, it's kind of different colors, right? It's kind of not totally black, it's not totally brown, it's got different colors. Now, so it's now more complex. Therefore, that's what life is. We're like a cup of coffee. We start off with this state, we become more complex, but then everything smooths out and we're brown. It's kind of a crazy argument, but that's the argument. And so from Carroll's point of view then, life occurs to increase entropy. But why would the universe do that? Why would the universe, it's kind of like why would the universe do anything? It doesn't have a mind to it if you're a materialist. So what's the point? Is there really a reason? Why does there need to be entropy to begin with in the universe? But according to Dr. Carroll, that explains the complexity of life, and that's what explains why life seems to contradict the second law of thermodynamics. A very weak argument. So the simple fact that entropy is increasing is what makes life possible, but they never answer the question, at least to my satisfaction and probably yours either, why? Why is that necessary? It is not necessary. It's not a necessary function of chemicals to develop into life, and we're going to look at that. And I believe what Kerr Thompson said. The second law tells us clearly that life could never get started by the activities of matter and energy unaided by outside intelligence. It just could not have. And there would be no reason for it to if it could. There's no reason for it. So, could God have violated his own law that he created? Well, of course he could. So he did. And so life does violate this law. In my opinion, it contradicts it, but God certainly could have caused that to happen. Now, once life was started, it perpetuates itself through DNA and replication and so forth. And we'll be looking at that in lessons down the road. So, since the beginning of kind of Darwin theory, and probably even before that, there have been experiments to see if mankind could create life. And that's what we're going to look at the rest of the night. We're going to look at this concept of the origin of life. And if you younger people that haven't been too far removed from high school will remember some of this, and others may remember it. But one of the very, very, very first studies or first experiments that I recall that was done by Stanley Miller and his Professor Urey in 1953, which interestingly enough was a fun year because that's the year I was born, but that's beside the point. But it's also the year that DNA, the double helix molecule, was discovered. A lot of things good happened in 1953. But anyway, Miller was a graduate student, and he decided that he was going to try to create life, or at least the compounds that would produce life, in the lab. And so he set up this now famous iconic apparatus, and it looks something like this. And this is taken straight out of a textbook. And so you had these little beakers that had various chemicals in them, water, of course, methane, ammonium, hydrogen. These were all floating around in this. And then you had a heat device that was bubbling up, trying to create these chemicals. And you had a lot of things that were done to make the conditions sort of just right so that the chemicals necessary for life would be created. And then this study that Miller did was published, and now everybody knows about the Miller-Urey, or just the Miller experiment, because as a result of that, he created a couple of amino acids. And this was held at the time as proof, absolute proof, that life could become or could develop by purely naturalistic means. Clearly there was intelligence behind the Miller-Urey experiment, wasn't there? The conditions were set and so forth. We'll look at that in a minute. But even if you did create a couple of amino acids, that is a far, far, far cry from creating life, wouldn't you think? It's nowhere near creating life. And yet it has been touted since the experiment was done as one of the hallmark experiments in evolutionary theory, because now we had an experiment that showed we understand amino acids are necessary for life, don't we? Proteins are made from amino acids when they're arranged in a certain order. So now you've got the building blocks for life, and the scientists took this and have just run with it. Few problems though. And again, this experiment was done, it was using intelligence. There wasn't just random chance. First he had to put the chemicals in there, and then he had to set the apparatus up. And one of the things he needed was a trap. The trap that was in this apparatus, if it wasn't there, the molecules would have been destroyed. It needed a trap, otherwise the very energy that created the molecules would have destroyed them. So you had to have some place to put these things when they were made, and that was the trap. If you didn't have that, do you think that would have occurred in a natural world? I mean, the universe would have had to have made that trap? No. And here's a key one. Now, I don't necessarily agree about the Earth's early atmosphere, but let's say I am a materialist and I have come up with this idea of what the Earth's early atmosphere probably looked like. The Earth's early atmosphere, according to the materialists, not Christians, not creationists, but materialists themselves, would not have been what Miller created in his lab. It wouldn't have looked like that. So his own premise was wrong to begin with. It wouldn't have looked like that. So now, really and truly, no one believes the Miller experiment was valid. They have now decided, primarily because of this atmosphere problem, but also for other reasons now, that the Miller-Urey experiment was a failed experiment. It really didn't prove what it set out to prove. Here's the interesting thing, and the reason I brought this textbook, though, is it's still purported as a valid experiment in our textbooks. And this is straight from biology. It's the textbook that's used in the state of Texas, or at least it was a few years ago when I was given this textbook. So it's still in there. The very iconic picture I just showed you of the Miller experiment apparatus is in there. And it's touting to students, to young people, that this was a valid experiment and gave it a rationale for how life could develop. And I'll give you a quote there. This is right underneath the experiment, by the way. I took this right out of page 424 of the textbook. Miller and Urey's experiments suggest how mixtures of the organic chemicals necessary to life could have arisen from simpler compounds present on a primitive Earth. Now this is really interesting though, because if you read the fine print on the same page, it says, scientists now know that Miller and Urey's original simulations of Earth's early atmosphere were not accurate. So why do they put it in there? I mean, that's a contradiction. Am I missing something? They've already told you now that they now understand that it wasn't a valid experiment, and yet it is still there. There's only one reason for that, and that's to indoctrinate kids, to make them believe how simple it is to get compounds that could eventually produce life. and they contradict themselves. It's kind of like, who proofread this? Now, there's been other experiments since. That was 1953. And that's what we're going to talk about as we get into this study. There have been other experiments, and there have been other amino acids that were created. But this original experiment is what's showing up in textbooks. And now we know it's not true. It's not true. So that brings us to the concept of DNA. Life is composed of DNA. All forms of life, be they bacteria, be they plant life, be they animal life, be they fish life, you name it, every life form is composed of DNA. Or in some cases with viruses, RNA, a kissing cousin to DNA. Francis Collins, who is a Christian, although he believes in he believes in what you and I would call maybe theistic evolution, although DNA was put here by God, it then evolved into life. He understands how impossible DNA could have been created on its own. I don't quite get Dr. Collins, and he was, by the way, Francis Collins was head of the Human Genome Project, very, very brilliant man. If God could have created DNA and put it on Earth, couldn't he have created all the animals and put them on Earth? Why can't, I don't quite get that, and the evidence is really against that, but his book is still a very brilliant piece of work. And in that he talks about the language of God. DNA is the language of God when it comes to life, because that's what determines what form of life you are. It's your DNA. How tall you are, what color eyes you have, that sort of thing, all determined by your DNA. What makes a rabbit, what makes a dog, it's all DNA. What makes an orange an orange, so on and so forth. And Collins has called the DNA molecule the language of God, and I think that's appropriate. But if you don't remember anything else about DNA, and I know you've been through this in high school and college and so forth, so I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but the most important thing to remember about DNA is it is information. It's information. DNA tells the organism what it's going to become, and that's what it is. It's information. What does information imply? It implies a mind behind it all, doesn't it? It implies an intelligence behind it all. And DNA equals information. So if nothing else of this lesson tonight that you don't get this. DNA equals information. DNA codes for proteins. And the proteins are the basis for what's called, or is for life. And Francis Crick, not Francis Collins, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix molecule with James Watson, understood this very, very early on in his what he found out about DNA. And so he understood that this information then that's in DNA and how these nucleotides are arranged would code for life. He called it the sequence hypothesis. It's no longer a hypothesis. It's actually a fact. That's what life is all about. How these nucleotides are arranged to code for first amino acids, then proteins, determines what life is. And this is what Stephen Meyer has said. Stephen Meyer is out of Seattle, Washington at the Discovery Institute's written several brilliant books. I would highly, highly recommend them. Signature in the Cell is one of them, and Darwin's Doubt is the other. He says evolutionary theory could not explain the origin of life because it could not explain the origin of genetic information of DNA. Just evolutionary theory cannot explain this. Doesn't have a clue how this information got started. So just real quickly, not to bore you to death, but what is DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid, which is considered a quote-unquote polynucleotide. It's composed of 5-carbon sugar, deoxyribose, a phosphate group, and 4 nitrogen bases, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, and those are the keys to the information. Those 4 nitrogen bases are the key to the information. And again, in 1953, Watson and Crick, they didn't discover DNA. They discovered the double helix. We already knew about DNA. The compound had already been discovered. They discovered the structure of DNA. And the structure implies how this information is transcribed. And the peculiar thing about it, and this is a molecular thing, but to me this is the way God intended it and God made it, is A always goes to T and C always go to G. No other way for that to happen. Adenine goes to thymine, cytosine always goes to guanine. They combine together. So those molecules, those nitrogen bases will always attach together. But they will attach in different sequences. Hence the word, the sequence hypothesis. And so when arranged in certain order, and they call this order codons, or codones. And generally it's 3 nitrogen bases for 1 amino acid. That's not exactly true, and there's some overlap. Some of them code for the same. Sometimes it can take more than those, but I'm going to try to make it real simple here. And that is that it takes 3 of these nitrogen bases, how they are arranged in order, to code for amino acids. Well, that gets you the amino acids. That still don't give you a protein though, but they have to be coded to get to these amino acids. And then the amino acids needs to be arranged in a certain sequence to produce a very specific protein. And there are thousands of proteins in our body. I mean, there has to be, and all other animals for that matter too. So it's how these nitrogen bases are arranged that determines the protein. Determines the amino acid first, and then how each amino acid is arranged determines the protein. And in some cases, we're talking about thousands of arrangements to equal 1 protein molecule. It's extremely complex, but easily duplicatable, because when you unzip that helix, that double helix, then you've got another helix that can attach right to it. And that's how proteins are made, from RNA taking that information and going into the ribosomes and so forth to create proteins. So what's the big deal? What's the big question that should be just extremely obvious to anyone? And first of all, humans have 6 billion letter code, 6 billion letter code. The obvious question is, where did it come from? Where did the information come from? Scientists cannot tell you that. I don't think they'll ever be able to tell you that. Where did that information come from? By chance? Well, that's all they've got. Stephen Meyer says, simple, regular geometrics plus rules of chemical affinity do not and could not generate the specific complexity present in functional genes. There's no physical reason. There's no chemical reason. We're going to look at James Tour later on. If not tonight, then next week. Look at what he's looked at as far as the origins of life are concerned. There is nothing chemically that requires this. There's no geometric rules, no chemical affinity. Somebody had something, God, someone of higher intellect than us, had to come up with this specific order of those nucleotides to produce this information, and then the specific order of those amino acids. So what's their explanation? It can only be one thing. It can only be one thing, and that's chance. Because if it isn't chance, then you're bringing in an outside source. Now you're talking about God. So it has to be chance, and maybe it's redundant to say it, but it has to be blind chance. That's the only explanation they have. And we've already looked at this. We won't belabor this. 10 to the 150th power, William Dembski says. I'd say it's very unlikely, wouldn't you? I would say it's extremely unlikely to even get enough information to build one bacteria, much less you and I. So that brings us back to, then again, the origin of life. So you understand the cellular theory of life. Everybody understand what I mean by that? Life is composed of cells. You and I are composed of trillions of cells, yet we're one individual. But our bodies are made up of trillions of cells, different kinds of cells, maybe muscle cell, could be a heart cell, could be a brain cell, could be a skin cell, you name it, respiratory cell, but we're all made up of different cells. Now this is kind of an aside, how does the body starts with just one cell, right? You and I began with one cell, and then that cell was impregnated with the sperm to become still just one cell, but then that cell divides and becomes 2 cells. 2 cells become 4 cells. 4 cells become 16 cells. 16 cells become 32 cells. 32 becomes 64, so on and so on and so forth, until now you've got 1 trillion cells. But it all began with one cell. one cell. How did that cell know which cells were going to become your brain, and which was going to become your heart, and which ones were going to become your muscles? Scientists don't know that yet. But that's the whole concept behind stem cells. You've heard stem cells and know what stem cells are. Stem cells have the potential of becoming different things. Heart, lung, brain, so on and so forth. That's the interesting thing about stem cells. And your body has rudimentary stem cells in them. It's in the bone marrow, and that's why you hear about what the bone marrow is used for stem cell treatment. They're doing stem cells now to try to regenerate cartilage in people's knee. My wife had one injected into her knee. Stem cells. These weren't stem cells from fetuses. These were stem cells from bone marrow and so forth. But my point is that we're all made of trillions of cells, and life requires cells. I mean, we'd all agree with that. Be it plant life, be it bacterial life, be it animal life, so on and so forth. You can imagine that cells are also extremely complex. So you not only have to create DNA, but now you're going to have to create DNA, and you're going to have to put the DNA in cells and create these organelles that are in these cells, which are highly complex. And I don't need to belabor what kind of organelles are inside the cell, but you know the nucleus and ribosomes and chromosomes and Golgi bodies and so on and so forth. Needless to say, a cell is a very complex thing. In fact, people have likened the bacteria cell as to more complex than the most complex refinery you've ever seen in the world. That's how difficult. You could not build a bacteria cell. We can build a refinery. We could not build a bacteria cell. Extremely complex. And yet that's what has to happen. So we're going to talk about that just for a moment, or what time we have, and we may have to take some of this over into next week. James Tour out of Rice University, brilliant man. I would highly recommend. He doesn't write anything, so you're not going to find a book by James Tour, but you can go to YouTube and see some of the lectures that he's done, and he's a brilliant man. He is not a creationist. He's not a creation researcher. That's not what he does. He does pure chemistry. He's a nanotechnologist, and he's got at least 6 patents. Very brilliant man, but he understands something that's peculiar about life, and that is molecules don't care about life. Molecules don't want to become life. They don't care about life. And he's looked at all origin of life experiments. He's done extensive research into this and looking at this. And he's decided, and I totally agree with him, that molecules do not organize towards life. They never organize towards life. They don't do it. Put some chemicals in a bag and let them sit there. They're not going to organize towards life. They don't do it. So the origin of life experiments have to be contrived by man, or those molecules aren't going to do them by themselves. They never will. But yet we hear all these things in your high school textbook about experiments, about how we're capable of creating life in the laboratory. And the punchline on all this is it has never happened. Nothing even close to it has ever happened. Very likely will never happen. Mankind hasn't come close to creating life in the laboratory. Not even close. And so he looked at all origin of life experiments. And this is how it goes. If you're doing an origin of life experiment, this is how you would do it, and this is how they've been done in the past. First of all, you buy very purified chemicals, just like Miller did back in 1953. You buy your whatever they are, sugars, sodium, ammonium, so on and so forth. You buy these very highly purified chemicals. Then you mix them in high concentrations in a specific order in controlled conditions. Now that's not how you would think life would have occurred, in controlled conditions in a specific order. But again, remember, it has to be random for the materialist. Then you obtain a mixture of compounds that resemble one of the 4 basic chemicals needed for life: carbohydrates, nucleic acids, amino acids, and lipids. So you get these chemicals, you mix them together, wham, I've got a carbohydrate. I've got a nucleic acid. I have an amino acid like Miller purported. Then you publish a paper. You publish a paper with bold assertions about the origin of life from those functionless, crude mixtures. Again, those amino acids aren't lined up to make anything. They haven't created a protein, they haven't created anything. But you publish a paper with bold assertions about the origin of life from those functionless, crude mixtures that are stereochemically scrambled. We're going to talk about that. All life is L form, not right form, as far as left form, not right form. But these are stereochemically scrambled intermediates. Then you publish a paper, then you engage the gullible press, turn up the knob on unjustifiable extrapolation. And that's what all origin of life experiments look like today. This very same thing. Have they created anything that looks like life? The answer is no. And I'll try to get through this. We've only got about 5 minutes. But the synthesis problem. And here's the problem when you're doing all of this. There are some problems. First of all, molecules that compose living systems almost always show homocularity. Now, that's what I was talking about. Your proteins all have, and all chemicals that compose life systems have a right and left side. In life, it's always the left. Sugars are right, proteins are always left. So you have to, they're not, you can't do that in a lab. You get this stereochemically mixed thing when you do them in the lab. And so polarity is mirror images of a compound, right or left. Amino acids are always L, sugars are always D. That's just the symbol that they're used to distinguish right and left. Your chemists know more about this than I do, but life shows this peculiarity. And so it is an important characteristic of life. Without it, we wouldn't have it. But yet, you don't get that in a lab. Why? No one knows. It just is. We don't know, but that's the way God made it. We don't know why that. They have ideas, but they really don't know. Secondly, when you have this experiment going on, you're going to have to constantly be redesigning, constantly redesigning would be needed, which would take you back to step one. And if you had to constantly be redesigning and take you back to step one, it would be hard to go further without this redesigning. But in nature, redesigning couldn't occur. The synthetic reactions would not know, and this is a big one, the synthetic reactions would not know when to stop. They don't have a target if it's materialistic. In other words, these compounds don't say, I'm going to make a protein that would make, let's say, a heart muscle cell. They don't have that target. So when would they know to stop? They wouldn't. They would keep going, is Dr. Tour's point. There is no target. And we always think of time in evolutionary thought as benefit for the evolutionist. But in origin of life studies, time is not of the benefit. And here's 2 reasons why. And again, you don't have to remember all this, but just let me tell you, time is not their friend. There's something called caramelization. Now, caramelization may be good if you're trying to eat popcorn that has caramel on it. I don't know. But in this case, it's not good because caramelization, when you heat up these sugars, it's going to destroy them. And then you have this Cannizzaro reaction, and it's a very complex description, won't get into it, but what it means is sugars reduce. So with enough time, these very chemicals that are using to try to produce life are going to break down. They're not going to stay around. And so that destroys it. And that's what we say here. Caramelization and Cannizzaro reactions, basically carbohydrates break down in time. The other thing is you need to purify these systems. A probiotic system cannot purify itself. Chemists can purify it, but a probiotic system would not. They would also need to continue to add reagents. Reagent is essential, and that would not happen naturally. And then all these other parameters have to be tightly controlled. The temperature, the pressure, the solvent, the pH, the gases, so on and so forth would have to be carefully controlled. And it's not like that. It would not be like that. And there's a few other problems. We will get into that next week because I was just been given the no time left sign. But next week we will finish this idea up. But just take it from Dr. Tour, and I trust him. He's looked at all this. I haven't looked at all these experiments he has. But no origin of life experiment yet has ever come close to producing life. And I find that remarkable, don't you? If all these things could have occurred naturally, why are human beings having trouble producing even the most rudimentary forms of life? And we haven't. And we're using mind behind it. But we have not done that yet. We haven't even come close. All right, thank you guys.